Hey everyone, it's nice to see you, Sukhinder. Thanks for joining our event today, and I'm going to turn it over to Joann Lublin.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joann Lublin. Welcome, Boardless community. I'm very excited to be moderating this really cool event today. But let me tell you just a tiny bit about me. I'm a author of two books about women in business, which are displayed behind me in this virtual background. The first one came out in 2016. It's called Earning It, Hard-Won Lessons from Trailblazing Women at the Top of the Business World. It featured interviews with 52 high-ranking executive women, of whom most were public company CEOs, people like Mary Barra, General Motors. My second book came out in February. It's called Power Moms, How Executive Mothers Navigate Work and Life. And I started reporting that after I retired from full-time work at the Wall Street Journal after a 47-year career and sharing a Pulitzer Prize. That book reflects interviews with women who have had children and gotten to the executive level from two generations, the boomer moms, my generation, and the Gen Xers and millennials. Today, we're going to be doing a very free-flowing conversation between myself and Sukhinder, exploring some of the major themes in her new book as they relate to women. And we would welcome your questions as we go along. You just need to post them in the Q&A portion of your Zoom screen. And those that are relevant to a topic we've just covered, we'll answer in the moment to the extent that Sukhinder thinks they're good and timely and appropriate to the topic we're exploring, which is a very important one. And it is an issue that I talk about, I don't devote a whole book to it like Sukhinder has, but I do talk about in Earning It especially. So let's start out. Everyone knows Sukhinder. She doesn't need any introduction for this community, that's for sure. But I'm not sure everyone who is watching today, Sukhinder, knows why you wrote this book. And in particular, what is the specific relevance of the topic of choose possibility for women at different levels of their careers and different ages for that matter?
Well, thanks, Joann, and thanks to everybody who is joining us today. It's really exciting to do this with our own community, so I really appreciate everyone showing up. Well, first of all, let me start with why I didn't write the book. I did not write the book, unlike you, to be a serial author. I don't think that my primary gift is writing, but I did write it because for the last many years, I've really believed that being in a place like Silicon Valley romanticizes myth-taking or romanticizes risk-taking and has created a lot of myths around what it is and isn't. And as a result, I think rather than it being more accessible for people, I think many people are daunted by the idea of taking a risk and assume it must be some large and miraculous pursuit with a lot of danger on one side and glory on the other. And obviously, having been here for many years and taking, I think, a fair number of risks myself, I just think nothing could be further from the truth. So for a long time, I've wanted to write the book to dispel that. And for women in particular, I know we're going to get into some of the research. There is, I would say, even more specific opportunity to take risks because the research would suggest, and we'll talk about it shortly here, that women in fact do take less risk than their male counterparts. And there are reasons for that we can talk about. And so if you say, well, is this topic, useful for everyone? I hope so. Is it useful at all ages? I hope so, because we deal with different fears. But I think for women uniquely, the opportunity to sort of reach our own full potential, part of that lies in taking more risks ourselves.
But don't you think that the issue of taking risk is much more relevant to individuals, women and men alike, at the early stages of their career rather than midway through or even late in their career? Or is it actually relevant at every stage of one's career?
I think it's relevant at every stage in the sense that, people think of risk as being a financial risk. But in fact, what we find as we grow older is our risks are not any less, they're just different. So I know for myself, when I left Google, my biggest risk was not financial. I was lucky enough to have some level of financial security, but the ego risk was incredible. And in fact, if you think about risks, not even at the large level, but at the smallest level, taking a risk at work today to have more impact. Much of those risks, even the little risks, we we ought to take are actually fear based on what people will think of us or what we'll think of ourselves if we fail. So I think ego risk, interestingly, is quite a daunting thing for people. And then the other thing that happens later in our careers is there are more trade-offs. I mean, there's absolutely more people to think about: your family, your significant other, your children. And so this idea of taking risk, it's not a singular decision. It's a decision that can affect more people than yourself. So I think we just live with a different basket of risks as we get older. And I think I think it's, you know, as much of a challenge when we're older as it is when we're young. It's just different.
Good point. And also, as you've alluded to in the initial part of our discussion, there is a distinct difference in how women and men take risks. Maybe at this point, you could give us some of the insights from the research you've done on this topic or other people's research that you know about.
Sure. So first, let me identify what the research says, because I think there's a lot of sort of confusion on, is this a myth itself or is it a reality? So in looking at all the research on gender-based risk taking, I found, you know, numerous studies, but I found one study that was a meta-analysis of all the other studies. So one study that was literally an analysis of 150 different pieces of research on gender-based risk taking. And here's what the meta-analysis found. On 14 of 16 dimensions that were categorized, women were more risk averse than men. So that was a little disheartening to me. I was hoping that the meta-analysis would reveal that we were exactly equal, and we're not. And then it revealed a couple of other things that are important. Number one, and Joann, this is your point, the gender gap on a lot of dimensions does diminish with age. So that is true. And I think that is more positive. So that would suggest as women get more experience, the gap with men closes somewhat on a number of dimensions. The other thing that the research pointed out is that context really matters. So there is, you know, remember I told you there's a whole spectrum of research. There's research that says men, you know, through the ages, starting with, you know, prehistory, or, you know, had to hunt for food and thus are more competitive. And because they're more competitive, they take more risk. You can find that type of study. But what the meta-analysis showed was that really context matters. So people are likely to take risk in two important dimensions. A, where they think they'll be successful. So you can see here how lack of confidence or faith in oneself can lead you to a downward spiral and not take risk. And number two, context they find valuable. So if you don't really care about the context, you might not take the risk. And that actually makes a lot of sense. So it would suggest that women may take risks in different areas that, you know, where the context matters to them. Maybe, and I think that that was like a really, really important point. But at the end of the day, the one piece of research that maybe made me both validated my concerns and others is that women also take less risk when they are perceived as less risk taking. So this whole idea that when there is a negative bias that we're aware of, we may be more likely to act in concert with that negative bias is also true. But at the end of the day,
self-fulfilling prophecy.
it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If women are expected to be less, you know, or less risk takers, then in fact that, you know, may inhibit them from even, you know, taking a risk that they might otherwise do. So the research is clear that there is a difference, but it does give me some hope when I see that context matters. And when we talk about risk taking in different dimensions and over time, also that gap closes as women get older. So I think those are some of the more hopeful things. But of course, our job, I think, as leaders is not only to model, I think, risk taking ourselves, but it's to encourage, you know, everybody we work with, all of our populations, to be able to have equal access and capacity to take risk in order to have more impact.
And not just wait until you get the confidence that comes with experience or age to.
Exactly, right? So this sort of comes to, right, how do we make risk taking accessible? And maybe the research just argues that it needs to be seen as even more accessible for women if they fear taking it.
I think it's like anything else. To the extent that we have gendered role expectations, which is that the guys are the hunters and the food gatherers, and therefore the ones who are putting their lives on the line every day, bring home that wild boar for dinner, then the men are going to live up to those expectations, that they're not going to be either afraid to take risks or admit their fears about taking risks.
Absolutely.
That women don't see that as part of what their expected roles are, or they worry about somehow going against the norms, then it is not something that they're going to be willing to do at a younger or less experienced point in their careers.
Yeah.
It comes down to what it is we think is going to be acceptable. And a lot of the studies I cited earning it, talk about the fact that, the women who are the most outspoken or adapt behavior that is more male-like are also the ones who are social outcasts in the workplace, when it comes to being accepted for who they are or even getting pay raises for that matter. But you, on the other hand, is, not someone who is afraid of taking risks. You have started 3 companies. You've been CEO of 2 others. You definitely helped grow Google extensively. And in the book, you say that despite some significant and potential fails, risk taking has delivered tremendous career returns for me along every dimension: financial, emotional, and reputational, which I think is very, very important. But in your case, why has risk taking played such an important role for you? And at what point did you sort of have your aha moment that this was actually a smart strategy to pursue?
Well, let me start with the aha moment, if that's okay. And I think the aha moment I probably had a couple that would surprise people. So my first aha moment came, the summer of my first summer in university, when I decided that I was not going to work for my dad in his medical office, which, like, my father was an entrepreneur. I worked for him every summer. He wanted me to work for him every summer. I did. So I was determined to not work for my dad. So I went to the local classifieds. You remember the classifieds, and I applied for jobs. And, I had no work experience. And I ended up working for the local Filter Queen franchise. And if you think about, people are like, what's Filter Queen? It's literally a vacuum cleaner that gets sold door to door to door. And so, like, this is the only job I could get. I wasn't selling the vacuum cleaner, but I was a receptionist in the office. So I ended up in this sort of warehouse, if you will. I was in the front office, and off to the side was all the action. And every day that room would flood with people who came in and tried to make their living by opening the yellow pages, and no joke, just cold calling person after person after person after person to get a demo booked in the hopes of selling this magical machine for like $1,000. And so you would think, like, oh my God, like, what a first job. And in some ways, I was a little mortified to be watching this all going on. But over the course of the summer, I moved from mortified to pretty darn impressed with people who had the gumption every day to just pick up the phone and call and make their living. And, for those of you who don't know, I mean, I started my career in sales and business development, where I too, like, through college, actually sold clothes. But that one experience of just watching people go to bat every day and, relatively speaking, like, develop a thicker skin in order to figure out the lead that was going to convert, that was like a really seminal experience for me. And I think when I entered sales myself, like, I sort of learned, like, you have to put yourself out there a little bit every day to make a living, and often do it in parallel. So that was like one really seminal experience. And the other one, which I often talk about and I talk about in the book, is during college, when I simply could not get the job of my dreams. I mean, I graduated without a job, and I was in, my self-esteem was in the toilet. I ended up taking risk after risk after risk to just try and get something to work out. And I had one experience when I really could not have been feeling worse about myself, where I applied for a job that MBAs were qualified for, not me. And I actually got the interview and got to final interviews, competing with people who had many, many more years of experience than I did. I had no experience. And I didn't get the job, but it boosted my confidence and gave me a reward that just kept me in the game. And I interviewed for several months more and took another risk. And I finally ended up on Wall Street after a year. But, like, that one risk I took of all of them, the one that gave me hope, where someone validated that in fact I was intellectually strong or smart or worth considering for something really ambitious, was kind of the risk that paid off, despite the fact that I didn't get that job. And so those are the types of experiences I had early on that were like, okay, you have to, you never know which at bat is going to convert. So you have to take the at bat. And I think both of those things really taught me early about the value of risk taking.
What I think is interesting is that you ultimately got turned down for that job, and yet that boosted your confidence as well as your willingness to take risks.
Mhm.
Whereas a normal mortal would have been like crushed ego deflated, hiding under the covers for days at a time.
Mhm.
Oh my God, they don't want me.
Yeah, but I think this is one of the magical things about risk taking. We tend to believe that the reward for risk taking is what we call the reward. And I'm like, I'm not sure because you may or may not get the reward you seek. After all, it is a risk, right? I mean, nothing in my book promises that if you take a risk, it will always work out. If you take a big risk, you'll get a big reward. Like the world is not nearly so neat and tidy. But I do believe that the fundamental benefit of risk taking is agility and confidence because once you understand that you can respond, I'll tell you, the world changes. And for me, like it gave me more confidence to fail at something ambitious than it did to sort of show up every day, just checking the boxes and applying to another job. Um, so I think the real reward is something much more, inherent.
Right. And looking beyond your own experience, I wonder how much you think risk taking has accounted for the success of so many other women besides thyself in the tech industry, where, of course, risk taking is what people pop is for their vitamins every day.
Well, let's put it this way. I believe that most people, successful or not, I think have a far less linear journey than we tend to see from the outside in. In fact, there's sort of been research done that, the New York Times had a whole article about the best path to the CEO seat is a winding one. And what it really posits is that people who are taking risks to learn in particular and have impact in different areas. LinkedIn talks about, how much CEOs or executives who rose because they diversified their skill set and took jobs that were new and adjacent to their core, competency. I think the line you will find that is the same is people taking risks to learn and expand their capacity as the through line in their careers. And so that's why I could argue that maybe you're Susan Wojcicki, who's the CEO of YouTube, and I've known Susan for 20 years. And you can say, well, Susan, has she taken any risks? She stayed at Google. And I would say, yeah, but if you just look at Susan's career within Google, she always moved to the new thing, the hard thing, and was willing to take on those assignments. If we look at the CEO of Citibank, obviously the first female CEO of a global bank, same thing. Her track record was built on, taking some of the tougher assignments at Citibank, taking a risk to go fix the LatAm business, coming in to help clean up the mortgage crisis. Now, we can have a whole other conversation if women are also given, the tougher challenges. But I think the through line for most leaders is taking on the challenge, even when the opportunity for failure is high, to either learn or have an impact. I think that's the through line, whether they stay in one place or like me, and have moved to different organizations.
Plus, you build on each one of those experiences, whether they end up, as you said, bringing the financial or professional rewards that you had hoped for at the outset. You're going to grow through these kinds of experiences in ways you never ever imagined.
Joann, there's one question in the Q&A that I think we're going to start picking questions from the audience too that I think is pretty interesting. This is Izora who asks, is there any data on the quality of risks taken by men versus women? For example, informed risk taking. And in fact, Izora, there is some research on this that I found. It gave me a chuckle, but it gave me a chuckle because quite frankly, I found it to be true in my own experience. There was data that suggests, and the research suggests that men and boys are more indiscriminate in their risk taking, meaning they're likely to take a risk even when they ought not to, whereas women are more hesitant to take even the innocuous and good types of risk. So that means that men at the end of the day have more at bats. Some of them, maybe risks not worth taking, but they are taking more at bats. And again, in the book, I really talk about the fact that this is a game of like frequency. You may fail more to succeed more, but men definitely take more shots indiscriminately than women do. To answer your question, sorry, Joann, you can go on. I just want to make sure we pick that up in real time.
In my first book, Earning It, that I mentioned earlier, I talk about how successful business leaders who are women often embrace traditionally masculine behavior to excel in their careers. And this was particularly true for the women I interviewed for that book who were in the tech industry, who believed that unless they drank a lot and swore a lot and drove fast sports cars, they wouldn't be accepted as one of the guys. And since there were so few women, particularly in management at that point, they wanted to be seen as one of the guys. In choose possibility, you don't specifically talk about whether you should alter your personality to fit in or to take risks. As it applies to women, why or why not should women be doing that today?
Well, I think there are a couple of things here. I'm never a fan, honestly, of altering your personality to suit anyone because, most of us want to move through our worlds authentically. And I would also argue that for most people, we're likely to take risk when we feel safe. Often we feel safe when we feel included and when we feel heard, right? So in some ways, it runs counter if you feel like you have to put on a personality or a persona to take risk. I would argue that in today's world, what's more important is to create environments where people feel safe and supported and included, meaning they share a value system, which makes them more comfortable, to take risks that they, might otherwise find too scary or, facing some of those fears we talked about. So I think that what I observe today is that, the opportunity to take risks is not just for those of us who are extroverted or aggressive. When you define risk taking, which you have to define more broadly, is not just like pursuit of some massive ambition, but risk taking to learn, risk taking to discover, risk taking to have impact. By the way, in the case of COVID, risk taking to avoid harm. Like we all had to be pretty agile, and we made rapid decisions in order to avoid danger. When qualified that way, I think women don't need to put on the mantle of aggressiveness in order to take a risk. There are opportunities to take risk every day. In fact, one of the things I would argue that I see more recently, and Joann, I'm curious if you do, I think we're watching a whole new cohort of female leaders, the Whitney Wolfs, the Katrina Lakes, the Rachel at Guild. I could run down the list of women who are building massive companies and are younger, who quite frankly take a different risk. The risk to show up as mothers, the risk to show up like fully as female leaders. They are building more diverse companies. They are building more diverse boards. But, Katrina Lake took her son to the stock exchange floor when she IPO'd the company. And so think we see a whole new generation of women who you might say are taking the opposite risk, the risk to show up as themselves, and to show up authentically, as their full selves versus feeling like they have to show up like a guy does. I love seeing those types of risks taken.
I totally agree with that. And it was one of the most clear distinctions I saw between the Gen Xer/millennials, the women in their early 30s or early 40s, who were the newer wave of power moms that I interviewed for the book versus the boomers. But the reason they felt more safe or safer about taking risks, about being their authentic selves, is frankly because there were trailblazers who had gone before them who had taken the ultimate risk, which is to be the first woman on the management team reporting to the CEO, to be the woman who would stand up as one woman did, when they took a break in the management team meeting and the guys went in the men's room and made a decision. And when they tried to do it the second time, she marched in after them and they said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, and this was a boomer mom, okay, not one of the younger wave, if you guys are going to make decisions in the men's room, I'm going to follow you.
Mm-hmm. There are a couple more questions, Joann, in the chat. So let me pull them up just to make sure we get them out. What are the consequences? I think this follows on your question about aggressiveness. What are the consequences different in your experience for women versus men taking risks in their career? And I think it's a fantastic question. I would say the consequences can be different when women are in environments of bias or discrimination. I talk about in the book that I'm somebody who believes possibility is abundant, that there is always an opportunity to take a risk, however small, to accelerate your impact. But I also am a believer that possibility is not evenly distributed, that we live in systems where women don't feel safe to take risks, where the environments don't treat people who look different equally, even if that's in the space of, in terms of microaggression. So I think the consequences can be different if you are existing in a system of, that has bias or discrimination. But I think even there is a silver lining, and there's danger as well, right? My belief is, and again, this is something I paused in the book, and I believe is what happened to me, is when I have ended up in environments that I feel values fit with the organization's leaders and the culture, I have felt more free to be myself and take risk without worrying about the consequence. By the way, if I've been in those environments and I've seen something that isn't particularly fair, I've also felt more comfortable speaking up without fear of retaliation, because I have a core belief, that I'm sitting in a place of values overlap with that organization. Conversely, the places I felt like least able to take risk, and I think women would say they feel more exposed, is when the inherent system of values does not overlap with our own. And then we really feel like if we take a risk to speak up, to be aggressive, even to identify an issue of bias, that we might well be actually retaliated against. And there is evidence that that's true. There is evidence that there are places where it's not safe to take a risk. And I think this comes sort of to the other question that's in the chat, which is, what distinguishes a good risk from a bad risk in your view? I think one of the things I've identified in the book, I think there are 4 key things that I think of as smarter risks. One is moving to environments where who we're working with are people who can teach us, who can complement us, but who share our values. I actually have identified that if I were to rank, my choices, I always rank the who, the environment I'm entering, for whether or not it welcomes my strengths and it is, I would say congruent with my values. And I think that's one of the very key things that distinguishes a good risk from a bad one. Sorry, Joann, back to you. I just wanted to make sure I answered that question.
Oh, but those are really good points, and they relate to my next question, because we're exploring how it is different in terms of women taking risks at work, and how there are going to be work environments where they don't feel it is as safe for them to take risks as perhaps their male counterparts. And in fact, this relates to a phenomenon I talk about in Earning It, which is called the glass cliff, which is the notion that some women find themselves assigned to roles that are sort of poised for failure. And so if you are in an environment where you supposedly feel safe, but nevertheless perceive that you're about to be asked to take on a glass cliff type of an assignment, how committed should you be to taking that risk of, a glass cliff type of assignment?
Yeah, it's interesting because as you know, there is research that suggests women are given turnaround situations more often than men. We certainly know that, that women, even who have succeeded, have often taken on the more challenging roles before hitting the CEO spot. Look, my own personal assessment of whether or not you take the risk to take on a headwind situation, whether you're a man or a woman, is fundamentally aligned with your belief on whether or not there is still impact to be created. Because sometimes, our opportunity to grow, as you know, is also in challenging situations. I feel like, at StubHub, I inherited a business that had very little growth, right? And, no relief from eBay because eBay was under stock price pressure. So, if I wanted earnings relief every quarter in order to fix the things that were troubling consumers, high fees or what have you, there was just no room. There was no room. But, I took that job for 2 reasons. I took it, number one, because I believed I could learn at an accelerated rate. So even though it was not the perfect job, I was like, I am going to increase my skill set. And number two, because I did believe I could have an impact. I was like, okay, I can bring to this task my full energy and my capacity as an entrepreneur. And quite frankly, the organization needs some of that strength and some of what I'm uniquely good at. So I'm actually a fan of people taking on challenging situations, men or women, though I freely admit that women may be asked to take them on more often. But for me, when I decide whether that's a risk worth taking, I'm looking at A, is it accelerated learning for me? Is there something I'm going to learn out of this situation I would not get as fast otherwise? And number two, do I believe I have something to contribute and I can have an impact? So, in my career, I think I've taken a number of roles that were either lateral, or brand new businesses, or, and sometimes challenging, sometimes not, because I just believe it accelerated my chance for learning and opportunity. And it was an opportunity I would, that might accelerate me by 3 or 4 years in my career if somebody gave it to me.
And did that indeed happen?
It did. It happened multiple times when I was, I think that, I think when I was in the Valley, I quit my job at Amazon. Okay, somebody could call that like a pretty stupid move after a year, but it was because I got the opportunity to be a co-founder at Yodely. I was 28 years old. I had no business like being a co-founder of a company. But when I was given that opportunity, I just couldn't pass it up. So I left Amazon and, and joined the team that founded Yodely. And, you know, by the way, from a financial point of view, it's absolutely a failure, right? If you look at what I made at Yodlee versus what I would have made if I stayed at Amazon, there is like, you can't even put them in the same universe. But I would also argue that at Yodlee, it built my reputation in the Valley. You know, it was only because of Yodlee that I got the opportunity to join Google. I mean, so this is sort of my point that, you know, once you sort of make the choice to take a risk to learn or have impact, it will pay off. It may not pay off as linearly as you expect. But I could trace a lot of my career in the Valley back to the decision to join Yodlee.
And it may pay off more on the reputational side than it
Mhm.
does on the financial reward side.
Absolutely, right.
Let's move on to another question, which is to look at, what kinds of steps women in particular can take to feel more comfortable about taking risks. Your book and my first book, Earning It, both describe the importance of perhaps arranging downside protection
Mhm.
as you go into what are clearly challenging or stretch opportunities. So when you took command of Polyvore, for example, you only did so after you designed a plan that would reduce your risk.
Mhm.
And your book describes them as, quote, people related strategies, ongoing professional support, and all important financial protections. So, not every woman who's stepping into a pretty risky or stretch opportunity can perhaps totally protect themselves against the downside. But, how do they sort of decide what the downsides are and make sure they get the protections that they want?
Well, I think it requires two things. And one of these two things may be obvious, but the other one may not. I think many people, and not just women, find comfort in taking a risk by doing a lot of upside planning. They do very detailed plans. So before we act, we create this detailed plan. And I'm very familiar with the detailed plan. As a CEO, you know, I've had to lead planning at places like StubHub or Joyous or Google, quarterly OKRs. But my observation is what people do to make themselves comfortable taking a risk is they do a detailed plan of everything that will go right. They just step after step after step after step. Like, first I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this. And I get like a page long set of plans. Ironically, people spend very little time building a plan for the downside. And I don't know if it's because it makes us feel more uncomfortable to actually just face, what happens in failure mode. But again, weirdly, when I'm a biz dev person and I move out of like my, prospecting for an opportunity and I have it in hand and I might, I'm going to win a deal, my mind actually switches right over to now I need to protect the downside in order to act. And as a biz dev person, I spend the next week negotiating a contract that has nothing to do with the upside, but literally it goes through every point that might go wrong and it creates mitigation strategies, right? So I think people are very used to building a plan for the upside. But, often I counsel people like, why don't you leave your plan to the upside rough? Because, if everything goes as planned, great. Like you'll have time to fill in the details. But if I had energy to give before I acted, I'd put it to the downside. I'd literally move to the other side of the equation and be like, okay, let's imagine the three things that go wrong. And I'm going to build my contingency plan for the downside. Because that to me is the most useful type of planning to do, right? It's actually the type of planning that can help you conquer your fear of failure because you sort of look at failure and you identify your choices after the choice. So I think people are very used to planning in detail for the upside. And I'm often like, hey, you know what? It's good enough to have a whiteboard plan, 3 bullet points, and I'm done. If everything goes the way I imagine, I will have no problems deciding what the next steps are. But if nothing goes as I imagine, I want to know right now what I would do. And I don't think I don't think that's intuitive to people. I think people create more and more detailed plans of everything that will happen just so. And it gives a false sense of comfort because everything has volatility. So my comfort comes from planning for the downside. That's actually how I get into action. So that's the unobvious one. The obvious one is negotiation. I think most people think like, how much should I negotiate? Do I look aggressive if I negotiate? I will say like risk mitigation comes down in commercial situations to negotiation and not just at work, but also at home. I mean, every time I've taken a work risk that I know has, honestly, not great repercussions for my family, believe you me, it has been a big discussion with my husband. We negotiated to have our third child when my career just, when I decided I was also going to go become a startup CEO. My husband was like, wait a second, what's happening here? I negotiated with Google, obviously, to take my daughter around the world with me. But I think that negotiation and, and really not just identifying the downside, but being quite dogged about negotiating what we need to give us those protections is another way of really getting ready to take bigger risks.
I think there was a great example of that in Earning of Ellen Kullman, long before she becomes CEO of DuPont. And she's asked to start a totally new business for DuPont.
Mhm.
And it's an area that they've never been in before. And everyone she talked to in the company told her she would be a fool to do this. She had a huge P&L responsibility. She was running a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing operation. But the CEO told her this was the future of DuPont, for them to go into safety consulting, and that he wanted her to be leading the future. And so to protect her downside, she asked him, what happens if it doesn't work? And he told her that give it her best shot. And if after a year or so it didn't work, he would find a comparable position at the same level she had left before, somewhere in DuPont. She also knew she was highly marketable outside the company at that point. And so she then turned around and used that downside protection to assemble her management team, because nobody wanted to come be on her management team for this new, business that the company was moving into. And so she did the same thing with her colleagues. She said, come be on my team. We're going to start this new internal venture. And if it doesn't work out, I'll find you something comparable to what you're leaving behind within the company. As female leaders, though, I wondered how individual women who are watching can help their teams take more risk at work. Given the differences that we've been talking about in risk taking between men and women, do you think that perhaps female leaders build teams that are less inclined to take risks? And for both of these questions, what's your advice for these women?
So interestingly, and I don't have research on this, this is my personal belief. What we do have research on is that women as leaders are far more empathetic than men. We know that women index differently on different skill sets as leaders.
Absolutely.
I do believe that when you have a woman leader, you have more empathy in your organization and likely more inclusivity. They by nature build more diverse teams as well. So weirdly, although we as women may, the research shows that we don't take as much risk as men, I believe we build organizations that make people, feel safe to take risks. So this is what I find most interesting, that, we probably are better at building those organizations in which people feel included, where they have diverse thinking is brought to bear, where there's empathy, for our whole lives. So I think women are probably better at enabling others to take risk as leaders. And I think that's incredible. But the other two things that I think people should do, and again, not just women, because I think women maybe more naturally do this, but all leaders need to do is, number one, model imperfection. And I mean, it's really hard to ask your teams to take risk if you yourself are not willing to show up imperfectly. Because we know that the very nature of risk is like the things your team tries won't all work. They simply will not. So this is, this is an obvious one, but modeling imperfection yourself. Number two, coming back to that planning, I think it would be really interesting for you to give your teams the freedom to bring you plans that are rougher to the upside, right? And account for volatility. Imagine if somebody said to you, imagine if you didn't press for the perfect plan, but you pressed for an outline and even a range of probabilities on the outcome that your team could identify and say, hey, this is what we're going to try for at the stretch, and this is how it's going to happen. Here are all the things that might go wrong, and here's where the numbers might end on the downside. I don't think we as leaders give our team a lot of opportunity to bring us plans with inherent volatility, if that makes sense, where they say like, let me talk to you about all the risks, even though I'm going to go do this, and let me identify a range, because that gives them the freedom, I think, to act as opposed to thinking that we expect perfect. And then the third thing, and I think we all know this, but we need to celebrate in our organizations and validate what I call the truth tellers, the people who are in a room who say something uncomfortable, the truth seekers, people who ask the questions, right? And even the constructive debaters. We may say, oh my gosh, they're holding up a meeting. But I think when we as leaders take these micro actions to validate, somebody else's behavior and everybody else observes it, it becomes sort of the culture of the organization, right? To mimic what is validated. And I think the next time you see somebody taking a small risk, a quiet person in the room who speaks up and, offers their opinion, the questioner, whatever roles they play, validating them in the smallest ways, not like in, it's just like, hey, Joann said X, great point. I think just micro actions that validate those who take risk in the smallest of ways is pretty powerful. People remember it. And then you start to see them doing the same.
And the role modeling, of course, is very important. In your book, you touch lightly on something called the imposter syndrome, but this is a issue that I found to be a very common concern among the executive women I interviewed for Earning It.
Mhm.
The imposter syndrome, of course, is this little voice inside our head that says, you're not good enough, you don't deserve that promotion. Who said that you could sit at the boardroom table during the meeting? You're a nothing. I wondered if you've ever experienced the imposter syndrome. If yes, how'd you cope? And if not, how would you suggest other women deal with the issue of feeling like an imposter?
I would say I feel like an imposter all the time. I think people somehow presume that, and again, I think this is a fallacy with risk taking, that those who take risks have no fear, that they don't feel inadequate. I would say, I think when we take risks, we're kind of living in constant discomfort, right? It could be micro, it could be macro, right? So you sort of have to get comfortable with discomfort. But I've taken a lot of risks in my career to learn, which by its very essence means I don't know the thing I've been hired to do. Like, I categorically do not know it. When I became a founder, I knew nothing about financial services. When Google asked me to run local, I knew nothing. When they asked me to run international, I had never spoken another language outside of Punjabi, which, by the way, was not at all useful to my job. Right? Like, I literally knew nothing. So, if by its very nature, when you're taking a risk to learn something new, you are not yet the thing you seek to be, which means we all are living with imposter syndrome, right? Some people just hide it better than others, right? And so
The men hide it better.
the men hide it better. But I think that my way through that scenario, and obviously this is cyclical, is, and this is why I say risk taking has to really be a habit, right? After taking a number of small risks, right, where I figured it out, like I quit my job and I moved to Silicon Valley and I got a job. Once you've been through enough cycles where you know that you are capable of, mastering the thing you don't yet know, that is the thing that ultimately helps with imposter syndrome. You sort of say, okay, if I've done it before, somehow I will do it again. I don't know quite how. But that kind of confidence only comes, right, with taking little risks and, figuring it out. And if it didn't work, even recovering, right? Whatever those are, the minute we have some sense of our own agility and confidence that we can respond, this idea of imposter syndrome, it's always with you. But you're just like, okay, I have my game plan. I'm going to go through it. I have, somehow I will emerge on the other side. And I think that's really hard when you've never done it. But, the good news is everybody on this phone, they have been through many situations in which they've had to learn and, pick up something new. So for me, I have imposter syndrome all the time. I mean, what am I doing being an author? Like literally people are like, you're an author. I'm like, I'm actually not an author. I wrote a book, but there's a very big difference. I am not an author, right? I feel that even now. But I guess for me, and I talk about this a lot, my fear of failure is often exceeded only by one thing, which is my fear of missing out on learning something new or having an impact that I haven't yet had. And I just, I feel like imposter syndrome is the necessary evil of trying to grow yourself. So you just are like, it is what it is.
As part of overcoming your imposter syndrome, you should accept the fact that, yes, you are an author.
Thank you for saying that. How about I'm not a good author? Anyway, the point is simply that we, whenever you do something you're not qualified for, de facto, you are living in imposter syndrome territory. So it just is what it is. There are a couple more questions that aren't in the Q&A, Joann, but they are in the chat. So maybe I'll just zoom back. You said, somebody asked, how do you think about the risk of taking a break, particularly for executive women? I think that is a really good question. Undoubtedly, again, we know this from the data. When women leave leave careers in the middle of their career, they do take a hit, because what typically happens is they step out of the workforce. If they step out totally and come back in, they're entering at their previous level at best. Whereas everybody who stayed, men or women, right, have continued to progress their careers. So for sure, there is a risk to taking a break, but I think it also depends on where you are in the organization when you take it, because when you take it, where you leave is where you enter. And so Not because I ever planned it. I certainly did not. I got married very late. I was 34, I think I was 34, 35, not that late in today's terms. But, when I was growing up, my mom was freaking out. Let's put it that way. Um, but by the time I exited, I was already a quite senior at Google. So I had a level of holding power and influence. Thus, I knew that when I didn't, I shouldn't even say I took a break. I basically had a baby, right? And I came back. I knew I was at least entering at a point of power or influence where I had some negotiating leverage. So I think that it is possible to exit and enter, and I know many women who've done it, but I think we need to be cognizant of, what is the leverage we have when we leave, and what is it that we can negotiate for ourselves as we're leaving, to make our reentry better. And I think often we think if we leave, we can't negotiate anything. And I think there is the opportunity to think about what you might negotiate for if you're choosing to take a break, to keep the door open for yourself when you return. And the level at which you exit, it does matter. I mean, it's sort of like, what's your influence base when you leave? Because that's typically where you return at.
Excellent reply. Is there another question?
No, let's see if I think we probably have time for one more before we've got to let everybody else wrap up. I don't see any other ones in chat that are recent, so I'll leave it to you, Joann, for the last question.
So as I talked about earlier, my new book appeared earlier this year, and it really looks at encouraging working mothers to recognize their power to be their own true selves, even if that does mean taking a break from work. Because you can continue your professional development even if you're not working. But it also talks about the importance of empowering others. And that's why when I autograph my book plates for people who want to put a book plate inside their Power Mom book, I write power on, because I do think we don't recognize the power that we have to be our own true selves. In your opinion, how can working women best recognize not only their personal power, but their broader power that they could achieve by being risk takers?
Well, I think maybe you hit the number one word I believe in. I think there is an opportunity in today's day and age where, not only do we have demographic, societal, and kind of what you call it, regulatory pressure on diversity and sort of diversity in leadership, we have this moment where, your authenticity is no longer a weakness, but it is a strength. Like, as people seek to see women and diverse leaders enter the ranks of power, whether it's the boardroom, whether it's, the executive suite, you now have a seat at the table. And the best thing to do in using that seat at the table is to show up authentically and give other people the permission to do so. So I think the good news is, in a world that is, has a massive tailwind on diversity, our opportunity, I believe, as leaders, is to show up authentically and create the permission for other people to take the risk to do the same.
Excellent. And on that note, for those on the call who are not getting their free copy, how can they get a copy of your book?
Well, I think we offered free copies to the Boardless community. So thank you, everybody who joined in, and hopefully you'll get your copy in the mail. But if for some reason you were not among the 300 who got the books, you can always get the book at Amazon or any of your local retailers.
And the same is true for both of mine.
Absolutely. Joann, yeah, Joann is the real author. I'm just faking it. But anyway, thank you everyone for joining us. And it really was fun to talk about the new book with all of you.